Hello, everybody. My name is Val Zavala, and welcome to another terrific AltaSea virtual event. I'm so pleased to be your MC today. I spent 30 years at KCT Public Television in Los Angeles as a news reporter and news executive, and I'm now retired and very, very interested in the environment, which is why the work being done at AltaSea is so important and exciting. Now, today's webinar is the first of 4 that are scheduled on each Thursday in May. The purpose of the series is to put a spotlight on aquaculture, which is an emerging and fascinating sector in our economy and our environment. It promises future growth opportunities for our coastal ecosystems, and it is also building partnerships between business, universities, government, and communities. The webinar is being put together by CSUN, Cal State University Northridge, AltaSea, Beneficial State Bank, and the Los Angeles Coalition for the Economy and Jobs. Also, you are a part of this, so please to start putting your questions in the chat box, and that will be, your questions will be texted to me, and I really will try to get to all of them. We have a big group today, so I'm looking forward to your participation to make this a wonderful, wonderful event. All right, now I'd like to introduce our guests. With us is Janet Kubler. She is a marine biologist with decades of experience working with seaweeds. Her research has 2 main currents. One addresses climate change and disturbance effects on primary producers, focusing on resilience. And by the way, I had to simplify what she wrote because I didn't understand half of it. It's really amazing. She's working at the interface of the biotic and abiotic, the living and the not living. Her research addresses how biogeochemical effects on algae and aquatic plants can emerge in ecosystems. She also delves into the complex life cycles common in algae to learn about adaptive advantages and ecological consequences of reproduction. And that's just part of it, but we hope to learn a lot more by the end of the webinar. Welcome, Janet.
Thank
also
you.
With us is Phineas Makepeace. He is with Kiss the Ground, a nonprofit dedicated to revitalizing the Earth's depleted and dead soils. So he is not an aquaculture guy, he's an agriculture guy, but you'll see how the two really interface and can possibly even help each other. And yes, there are critical links between the two. Phineas is a renowned presenter, media creator, and thought leader in the field of regenerative agriculture and soil health. Kiss the Ground's mission of inspiring participation in global regeneration, starting with soil, has motivated him to develop training programs, workshops, talks that empower people around the world to become confident advocates for this growing movement. And the documentary Kiss the Ground on Netflix is a must-see if you want to understand how important our soil is. Also with us, Dr. Charlie Yarish. He is an extensively published award-winning professor emeritus at the University of Connecticut. In the 1980s, Charlie collaborated with a multinational group of scientists and engineers to develop and define multi-species ocean farming, or integrated multi-tropic aquaculture, which we now call regenerative ocean farming. In 1992, Charlie organized a team of scientists in New England to study the red seaweed called nori. And among his many achievements, he helped develop the global and North American seaweed aquaculture industries, and established the internationally recognized Seaweed Marine Biotechnology Laboratory at the University of Connecticut. So welcome all of you. It's just terrific to see you. And I'm going to start with Professor Yarish. If you can just give those of us for whom aquaculture just means stuff growing under the ocean, if you can give us a little bit more, a better idea of what it is in just the basics, if you would be great.
Well, what I'd like to do is talk about my favorite group of organisms. And just like on land, we have agriculture. Well, in the sea, we have developed over the many decades the seaweed industry. And it's been an industry dominated by Asian countries. Over 99% of the global seaweed industry is produced in Asian countries. Most of it is going to a variety of uses that all have economic value. And in the last decade, these uses have caught the eye of many people in Western countries and said, people are interested in, can we grow our own plants in the sea? And where can we do that? What's the value of that? And you can see here for some of the different seaweeds there, uses foods, feeds, fertilizers for linking the ocean aquaculture, ocean farming of seaweeds, to terrestrial agriculture, part of that regenerative area that we're talking about. And there are also other uses as well of seaweeds. Now, what I wanted to do is really introduce the regenerative aquaculture because it had a profound impact on myself when I was a student. And this was the work of a scientist of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. His name was John Ryther. He was the head of, he was really leading the world in an area which people in the West didn't appreciate. And what he said, we can use all the excess nutrients that are available and we can grow organisms. And in addition to growing organisms, we can also produce the biomass of the seaweeds and get energy from that. But from his work, there was the development in the 1970s of integrated multi-trophic aquaculture. Some people would call it polyculture. And Ryther really was ahead of his day. And I had the opportunity to visit with him when he was at Woods Hole. And I like people to realize when we talk about regenerative aquaculture, this is where it started, at least in Western countries. Now, we've been working a long time, and I keyed on certain types of seaweeds, which I felt had application in Western countries, and one has to do with kelp. And we have a kelp species along in the Atlantic called sugar kelp. On the West Coast, you've got a beautiful kelp. It's really very important, and it's been involved in agriculture, regenerative agriculture from wild harvesting, and now it's being farmed, and that is the giant kelp macrocystis. But we've been at this for a long time, growing different types of seaweeds. And I just wanted to introduce a long time in 1988, we introduced economically important marine plants of the Atlantic. What seaweeds would have application to North America? And it was found in this publication, and we had a big symposium. And then in the 1990s, we brought seaweed to the forefront of the aquaculture world to show the rest of the people globally what seaweeds were doing. And in that major meeting in Las Vegas, we also introduced the other specialists in aquaculture. This was really important. And finally, I just wanted to show, just like in agriculture, you have manuals how to grow things. About 15 years ago, I decided, why haven't we expanded seaweed industry in North America and in Europe? And I just said, we have to get the information to the people. And there we developed online programs, social media, we used manuals, everything was made open source and readable. And this was very important. So this is really a stepwise approach of developing aquaculture of seaweeds, regenerative aquaculture, linking it from the ocean to the sea. And it's about recapturing those nutrients that end up in the sea that really need to get back on land. Thank you.
That was terrific. Thank you so much. And I have to say, I'm told there's more kinds of kelp than there are sort of kinds of plants on the land. I'm not sure if that's true, but it's incredible. Dr. Kubler, can you explain a little bit? I understand that your work initially you were interested in climate change in the ocean, and you've really gotten into aquaculture. Why the change, and how are the two related?
Oh, absolutely. I have spent decades studying how seaweeds respond to climate change, how they're affected by climate change. And the answer is not that much. But except seaweeds generally thrive in a wide range of conditions, and they can adjust their physiology to changes in their environment around them. Many seaweed species are actually pretty good at and compensating for things that people do in coastal water. So seaweeds, we put nutrients in coastal water, seaweeds take them up and use them to grow. And the same with putting CO2 into the atmosphere and into the water, and the seaweeds benefit from that. So in most parts of the world right now, seaweed abundance is increasing, and seaweeds are doing better under these conditions, except for in a few places where some species maybe were near their upper thermal limit and warming has forced those species out. But in general, seaweeds are having a great time currently, and it's a great time to grow seaweeds. So over these years of doing this, I have of studying ecological challenges, I've realized that I'm less and less interested in recording the problem and more interested in studying the solutions. And aquaculture is definitely going to be a solution to at least one current ecological problem we have, which is providing more food in less ecologically damaging ways.
And they also absorb CO2s, correct?
Yeah.
I mean, correct. So as the ocean becomes more acidic, does seaweed help with that problem?
Yes, seaweed takes up CO2 from the water. So, we're adding CO2 and they take it up and incorporate it in their biomass.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Finian, how does it, your interest, of course, is the soil on the land. How are the two related?
Thanks, Val. Really, I think the broadest context that they're related is really what we argue is the most pressing mindset shift for humanity. Moving out of this concept of what we can do to conserve and maintain what little is left, and really move into a place of regeneration. For others, that means restoration. But at the very core of it, it's a fundamental question of how we're viewing what humans are going to contribute to in the coming years, if not right now, in short years to come. Are we moving from a force that is degenerating our land and our oceans, or are we going to be a force that's regenerating it? And at the end of the day, that's really the big question that we have to ask ourselves. One thing that gets kind of glossed over a lot is oftentimes it's just a big bubble or throwout of climate change is causing this. When we don't dissect that and start to look at what that means on a more holistic frame, we can often get ourselves in polarized arguments or miss the mark on what humans can actually do to start being a contribution for good. So just to parallel this for a second, when I'm sharing with people about the situation on land, we look at degeneration happening at incredibly alarming rates. So we're losing the capacity of land to function as it's designed to do. The ability for it to sustain or maintain or provide for life. So when something is desertifying, as is happening across the globe at every year, farmable land, we're losing 32 million acres, the size of England, of farmable land is being so destroyed it can no longer be farmed, even with a bunch of chemicals added. That's the rate of land loss of farmable land that we're losing every year because of degradation. What that means is we're losing its capacity to provide food or whatever for us, but also for animals and things that are thriving in those ecosystems. But at the core of it, what I want to share with folks is, how are you looking at function? When something is broken, it doesn't work. I'll just share my slide for my screen for a second. In this picture here, we're looking at a cup, right? What does the cup no longer do? What it was designed to do. The broken cup no longer holds liquid. The analogy here, if we're talking about our land or our oceans, This is what a lot of it looks like. Pretend the blue sky is just the blue ocean. In a lot of cases, we're dealing with places that are being desertified in some form or another, meaning the keystone species have been knocked out in some form or another. They're being farmed so much that they're broken. Now, this is a really easy picture to grasp because it's, or not easy, but looking at that soil, if I told you what happens when it rains on that soil, if you really think about it, that's degraded soil that's vulnerable to wind and water erosion. It's compacted. When it rains, it doesn't infiltrate the water runs off, carrying with it, average of 4 tons of topsoil per acre per year on our agricultural land. So it's broken. It doesn't hold water, for example, right? Or it doesn't provide for animals to live there, bird habitat especially, et cetera. So if we're talking about how do we regenerate that and make it function again, that's a new conversation. Now, the big fun part of this is we all know, everyone knows at this point, that we have too much CO2 in the atmosphere problem. My question for the audience is, what glued the cup back together in the metaphor of building soil back together? The answer is carbon from our atmosphere that's currently causing too much heating effect. That carbon, pulling it through plants, pumping it into the soil to feed organisms in the soil, that is what creates the glue. This is a long story short, so lots of science behind this, but we don't have time to get into it. But the point is that the problem that we're dealing with right now, called too much CO2 in our atmosphere, is the solution to build back our functioning soil ecosystem. So the problem is the solution. We can do it. And I'm going to stop sharing my slide here. Whoop, for a second. Where's my stop share? But this analogy, to pull it back to the ocean and aquaculture being regenerative, I think comes back to this context, Val, where we're saying, how are we looking at this? Where are we helping an ecosystem to function again? And sometimes that's bringing in keystone species that were knocked out, like they did with Yellowstone. We brought in wolves, and all of a sudden the rivers were flowing better again, and our water cycles are better because the elk and other animals had been moving as they were back in the wild. Or in a case where the oceans are concerned, sometimes it's planting seaweed to bring back that base for those organisms to come back, the shellfish, all these other organisms that are keystone for that ecosystem to function at its highest state, to function as it was designed. And sometimes that means bringing in certain otter species. I don't know, you guys know the science of that more, but the point is that humans have the wherewithal to think about, what are we doing to practically help this ecosystem come back to its highest functioning state? And that varies on climate, that varies for the land, of course, like whether you're in a brittle environment, whether you're in a place that's supposed to be grassland, whether you're in a place that's naturally supposed to be tree canopy. All these contexts matter, but we can take context and think of humans as a mechanism to help get the ecosystem back to its highest functioning state while we're farming. So back to the basics. Last thing I'm going to say is regenerative aquaculture or regenerative agriculture. Take the word regenerative, which means something is getting back to its highest functioning state, upward curve, and take the word agriculture or aquaculture and put them together. So you're dealing with agriculture or aquaculture that is making the ecosystem, helping the ecosystem to function at a higher state, which usually means more biomass, means more life can be provided for. It's bringing itself back to its highest functioning state. So that's the general context that I think is important, that we look at all of these agricultural systems of the future through.
Great. Charles, I was going to ask you, you actually oversee or are growing seaweed in the New York City's East River, is that correct?
Yes.
How's it working out?
I am not growing it right now. However, I have grown it. Actually, my team was the first team ever to get the permits necessary to grow kelp, as well as other seaweeds in the East River, including some shellfish species. We had to convince all the regulatory agencies, give us a chance to do it in the East River. And we surprised everybody because we not only did it in the East River, we also did it as you go east into Long Island Sound. We did it along a nutrient gradient. And so what I'd like to do is just show a couple of pictures because in a sense, when we take a look at these pictures, they say it all. And, you know, we're over here on the West Coast now for the presentation. And here we are. This is Long Island Sound. Long Island Sound is a major estuary of the United States there. In the western end is the big city of New York. In the eastern end, you're going out to the Atlantic Ocean. Along that arrow, we have a nitrogen gradient that has caused major problems in Long Island Sound. And the problems there has to do with too much of something, too much nutrients. That has been a big problem. There's another problem that you've mentioned, ocean acidification, too much of that. And so we have to face these problems. And I'm interested in looking for solutions and how we can use seaweeds to deal with a solution. This is a problem of a harmful algal bloom in an area in Long Island Sound. You kills fish and shellfish, not good for recreation either. And so when we take a look at the areas of Long Island Sound, as you're going towards New York in the areas here, this is almost dead. And so I was able to get permission from the regulatory agencies to be able to try to come up with a solution to begin removing excess nutrients in Long Island Sound. And we set up key farms in the far west, in the west end of Long Island Sound, the Central Basin, along with this nutrient gradient. Just to give you an idea about what the Sound looks like today, we have areas that are in dark green. That's A-level water right now. Area down here in the New York area, that's poor waters. That's really what we call hypoxic waters. And it's being driven by nutrients. And we've developed a very simple concept. Grow seaweeds, grow shellfish, grow them together, and you are using organisms that are extracting nutrients from the water. We call this nutrient bioextraction. We said we could do this in urban waters. It's being done now in many different places around the world to really capture those nutrients. And when we look at that, here are the places that we had our experimental farms. And we had it for 12 months of the year because nutrients are in the water all the time. And we took a red seaweed that we thought would grow during the spring, summer, and fall. We also wanted to work with a winter species, and that winter species will be kelp. And we're able to grow that. We grew it in the laboratory tanks, but I think this picture shows it all. This is the East River right behind these students. And this is Gracilaria. We put out small little bundles the size of my fist, and we brought back soccer ball types of Gracilaria. We can use that Gracilaria for value. Growth rates, unbelievable, 16.5% per day. It was, the Gracilaria was using the nutrients that was available to them. And we figured out how much nutrients, how much productivity, how much growth we can produce at the Bronx, that's New York City and the East River, Long Island Sound. We compared it, and notice what happens in New York where you have all these nutrients compared to even Long Island Sound, which is still pretty good. We had tremendous growth. We looked at nitrogen removal. A lot of nitrogen can be removed by these seaweeds. You may ask what you want to do with the seaweeds. Well, you can put it within fertilizers, and we measured all kinds of chemicals that were in the seaweeds there, and they make excellent fertilizers if you want to do that. But they actually met the FDA ability to be eaten if we wanted to do that. But we didn't recommend that. We wanted to look at the application of just growing. And here we are, the kelp. And these kelp are not as big as your giant kelp, but they are very, very important in ecosystems around the world. And this is our sugar kelp. We decided that we'll grow it in the winter. And this just shows you the harvest of the kelp. And we started this off from microscopic spores. And in 5 months, we get these plants, some plants up to 10 meters in length. We figured out nitrogen removal. And now we also wanted to link it for carbon dioxide removal. BRE is New York City, the Bronx. I couldn't use East River in my discussion with different agencies because they didn't want to say East River. They wanted me to use Bronx River Estuary. But this is a picture of the kelp farm in the East River. And the picture in the lower right is in Long Island Sound, another kelp farm. Carbon, nitrogen removal. And the removal there is quite substantial when you take a look at grassolaria added in the summer months. So during the year, you can remove a lot of nitrogen, a lot of carbon dioxide. That does something for the ecosystem. The carbon dioxide removal there raises the pH. It's good for the shellfish. And we had shellfish growing in the area. This was such a simple system. It caught the attention of the US EPA. And they gave us a shout out about sea farming and saying that this may be a valuable tool for coastal managers. And you know, the valuable tool is problems of carbon dioxide, nitrogen can be captured and it can be recycled. And you can move that recycled material back to the land into regenerative aquaculture. We look at the oysters that we were working with, and you can see oysters are great filter feeders, and they use different types of nitrogen. They filter the plankton in the water, and they have a tremendous capacity. So when we look at shellfish like oysters and mussels, they are removing nutrients from the water, nitrogen. Sugar kelp, grassolaria, also removing nitrogen. And this is a management tool. And this is what we talk about nutrient bioextraction. Very simple, but it was something that hadn't been done in New York City. So what's new in coastal management today, and it's being recommended, is basically in nutrient-rich waters where you have problems with too much of something, you can grow shellfish and seaweed together. They provide invaluable ecosystem services. You can get your commodity. And if you have good quality water where you're maybe eating your shellfish, you can also eat your seaweed and use it for other applications. And I think I'll take it from there.
Wow. And we have to get used to the word nutrient not being a good thing. I'm thinking nutrients are good, but no,
Yes.
not when it comes to
You stimulate the growth of plants.
I see, but you don't want too many.
Right.
Because that's where you get these algae blooms that I hear are really can be very, very destructive. Is that right, Janet?
Yes, it's a balance. So you have, too much nutrients or a problem of too much of anything, right? So too many nutrients we call eutrophication. But if you have something in there that's taking up those nutrients like seaweeds, it balances it back out. And the seaweeds are also making some things, right? That they're making compounds that they put back into the ecosystem too. And those can feed the phytoplankton, the little microscopic animals that are also in the water, and that can contribute to the food web. So it's another way that just growing there and taking the nutrients in, doing the biology that the seaweeds do, that they contribute to the rest of the ecosystem, right? That they give back to the ecosystem, and that's regeneration. And that's something we're looking for.
Can aquaculture take care of, I think we're having a real serious problem with kelp forests, which are so important. Are they disappearing, if I'm correct?
They're in places, not everywhere. So it's where the kelps are near their upper thermal limit. So there are some places like that in Australia and South Africa that some kelps are challenged by the rising temperatures. And then in California, we have another problem on top of that, that there were some diseases of other animals in the ecosystem that have kept the kelp from coming back, especially in Sonoma and Mendocino County, not really north of that and not really south of that, interestingly. It's just that right there, it's at the intersection of these two biological challenges, the heating and the disease of the sea stars. So there are aquaculture operations right now growing bull kelp to plant back in there.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, Finian.
This is great. I just want again to throw out, like, inside of regenerative agriculture, there's always an option for something better to be happening. And when we look at today's agricultural systems, majority of our agricultural systems are using far too much nitrogen, phosphorus, fertilizers, plowing way too much, not covering their land at all nearly enough. There's all of these catastrophic problems, but helping regenerate or helping heal that land, you can do no-till, right? And that can have a significant impact. But part of humans' conditioning problem is that we'll see a situation, for example, like, oh, we don't have starfish, they're dying, we need to put a bunch of starfish. I'm not saying this is what the scientists tell us, but like generally the human mind will be like, oh, we need to just we just need starfish, let's just put them back, versus looking systematically at the problem. So, oh, the government of the United States is like, oh yeah, we can get behind cover crops because the chemical salesmen don't get harmed by that. They can still pour on their glyphosate and get what they want. Oh, we need cover crops. Great, we can support cover crops. But always in a regenerative system, you're going to help what nature perfected before and help that happen. So the holistic thinking is just super important. We always have to challenge ourselves of like, are we taking into account all of these factors? So biomimicry becomes this really important baseline thought for all of you out there thinking about this. Is like, you can help sometimes bust open siloed thinking, whether it's in your policymakers, because of what they've heard, the simple construct that they've had. You can always help them to be looking at a more broad perspective on how is the ecosystem harmed? How is it not working functionally? Think about your own human body, right? Just again, like play it out with me on agricultural land. When we till our land, how many of you have driven past miles of bare ground that's been tilled? Now think of your own body. How fun would it be to live if I skinned all of your skin off and put a fire on you and poured a bunch of chemicals on you? Your body is not designed to function like that. So when we look at the ocean and we see there's the problem, we're doing what our healthcare industry does and be like, you're sick, here's your prescription drug. Versus like, how do we heal you? So metaphorically, the oceans as well as our land is a person with third-degree burns sitting on an operating table, and our idea is to give them more medicine through a drip line versus say, how do we heal their body so that the burns heal so that they are able to function again? And that's really, I'm just imploring that all of us as advocates for this message are saying, there are so many problems that humanity has caused, so many problems that are taking out certain fish populations have caused. So a quote I have, or not a quote exactly, but an example from the Audubon Society is really crucial. This is a conservation stewardship organization that's been around for a long time that 10 or so years ago really had an aha moment. There are places around the US where bird populations were accelerating the most, endangered bird species. Where were they coming back? In regenerative grazed land, because those are the places that seeds that were waiting for better conditions came back, flower species, drought tolerant grasses like deep rooted perennial grass systems, where those systems were able to recover to what their native place was supposed to be 150, 300 years ago. That's where the birds came back, and that's where the populations of different organisms in the soil came back. That's where the whole web of life started supporting itself, from the very teeniest microbes in the soil all the way up. So when we look at this and you look at there's a film called The Biggest Little Farm we were talking about before this started. That's a perfect example of going from a very nude, degraded place and trophic cascades happening. And, you know, oh, wow, all of a sudden our soil's better and we have more biomass and more creatures here. Oh, we have a rodent problem now. Oh, what are we going to do? Kill all the rodents or get barn owls, right? We always have a regenerative choice that's going to help the ecosystem expand its capacity, its holding capacity, versus say, how do I kill that thing that's getting in my way now? So this is our lesson that many indigenous cultures have known. Somehow our whatever our issues are with Western dominated culture around the world have caused is a serious problem. Conquering powers not knowing the context of the land that they invaded. There's so many issues, and we can look to indigenous wisdom and knowledge. We can look to science that we have now from microscopes and everything that shows us what's happening. And we can look at context thinking, holistic management principles to really push against. This is a bit far out there, but I always say science is important, but remember who science's parents were. And we all think we're different than our parents, but we're not actually that different than our parents. A lot of the parent of science is monotheistic religion, dogmatic thinking. It's going to be hard for all of us to think holistically, magically, even though science rule tells us to. We're still inclined to be like siloed, not thinking holistically. So I'm just pushing out there. I'm not pointing any fingers. I'm just saying we all have to look to the ecosystems and mimicking biology to help it do what it's done, because we've done the damage and now it's up to us to help get it back to where it can be.
I want to get, we had a lot of questions, so I want to get to them. They're kind of all over the place, but that's okay. This question's been sitting here for a while, and I'm sure it's on a lot of people's mind. How might I'm sorry, hold on just a second. Is seaweed highly nutritious food? What types of nutrients can we obtain from them? Interestingly enough, my husband loves these for snacks. So are we going to be seeing, and they're really good. They're almost like air, but they're very tasty. They're good. So
Okay, go
are we
ahead,
going to be
Charlie.
seeing a lot more seaweed food? And could that be the answer to maybe some?
Very well. I could tell you that it's very nutritious. You're going to have certain seaweed higher in vitamin C than an orange per weight basis, more protein than a steak on a weight basis. You'll see in the next year or 2 years, you're going to see more of the plant-based products that are coming to market that are going to include seaweed constituents there, because of the opportunities, the nutritious nature of the product. The Asians have known it. China is the world's leader in seaweed production. Why? They have less than 5% of the arable land. They got more than 25% of the world's population, maybe more, and they had to go into the ocean. And it was seaweed farming that they turned to initially, because they also had a disease problem with goiter. They didn't have enough iodine in the diet. Well, we're just discovering that in Western countries. But I would like to bring back one thing and just show, again, my screen for a moment. And if I could just get that screen for a second. Let's see. Here we go. No, that's not it. I'm not sure what happened, but I wanted to say that when we are looking at seaweed products there, with the opportunities today of aquaculture of seaweeds in coastal regions and the applications, seaweeds also, especially different types of kelp, including the giant kelp, are really rich in something called biostimulants. These biostimulants are not your traditional fertilizers for NPK, but they are chemicals that the seaweeds produce that when you add them to terrestrial crops, they improve drought hardiness, they improve disease resistance, you get higher yields, and this is the production of these the seaweeds as you are growing them. Many of the kelps are producing these biostimulants. And again, this is linking the oceans to the sea, and I think to the land. And I think it's really important when we're looking at production systems to see how we can use problems and turn them into solutions. And the solutions then is regenerative farming that we're talking about.
Someone following up on this food source, someone asks from Tamsin, is there concern about toxicity for seaweeds harvested for food source? You know, like we have all these problems with pesticides in our food. Is there a similar problem when it comes to seaweed as food?
No, it's been interesting. When we did our project in Long Island Sound and the East River, I was told all the reasons why you wouldn't be able to eat the material and the biomass. And I had regulators saying, well, you're going to have heavy metals. You're going to have bacterial levels very, very high. Well, bacterial levels you could take care of in the processing of the seaweeds, drying them in different ways without worrying about that. But the heavy metals is really interesting. We had lower levels in heavy metals that met all the FDA standards. And
Wow.
that was for mercury, which is the only metal that FDA regulates, but we also measured cadmium, lead, chromium, copper. We had less levels there because what we're doing now, we put out microscopic plants, 5 months, we bring them back in after they've grown anywhere from 3 to 10 meters in size. That's the kind of variation. They're soaking up what's in the water. The problems are hidden in the sediments and they weren't picked up. So we had food grade material, which really surprised the regulators. And this is important because we do have to pay attention to site and we do have to pay attention to different types of seaweeds. But for the seaweeds that we had in our production systems, it was not a problem.
Janet, is that right? Is there, when it comes to growing in aquaculture, is there regenerative aquaculture and non-regenerative, or is it almost just naturally regenerative?
Well,
Yeah.
I would
Is there a
say
way to do it wrong?
that seaweed cleans, does bioremediation. It takes things up from the water. But regeneration is like a step beyond that, which is making it better. It's giving back to the ecosystem.
I see.
Right. So it's some of what the things you're growing in your aquaculture system leaks out in some way and supports the whole system. And when you have lots of parts in the system that are being fed by what you're doing, then the whole thing becomes more resilient to climate change, to any kind of small or large disaster, right? We know that life's very good at, taking a hit and recovering, like we see in Southern California, the hillsides burn and, it's wiped out. And then, 10 years later, it's hard to tell which place burned and which didn't, because life is being resilient. And, we can make, I hope, we can make aquaculture systems designed like ecosystems that can bounce back from challenges like that. And that's more what I'm thinking is regenerative, is to make it, like Finian said, make the ecosystem work better and be healthier. And it looks like he's ready to say something.
Yeah, go ahead, Finian.
Thank you. Both Dr. Charles and Dr. Janet, we've been talking a lot about kelp and the amazing abilities that has and all these different factors. I just want to remind everyone, from my understanding, again, and I'm coming from agriculture here, my understanding, aquaculture is broad. Obviously, there's this kelp stuff that can be like very likely to be regenerative. So in regenerative agriculture, there's a lot of systems like that. Be like, well, if you're doing agroforestry, multi-strata agroforestry, it's probably going to be regenerative, right? Because the context, but if you're doing row crop corn production, getting that to be regenerative takes a lot more of the adding of what's enforcing it to be regenerative throughout all your other parts of the year. So when you're talking about fish, growing fish in mass areas off the coast of wherever in these little net things, you're having so many unintended consequences and ultimate issues that you're causing, degenerating the functionality of that ecosystem. And that's a different case. So how is that going to become regenerative? Maybe we can start having more interconnected, maybe we can have more regulations, maybe we can have more ways that those fish systems are regenerative. Maybe some of them are inherently just outlawed. So when we look at shrimp, for example, shrimp in most, it could be considered aquaculture, but in most cases where shrimp production is happening, most of the shrimp all of us are eating is having really catastrophic damage occur for all of these coasts where they have, what's the kind of tree that we all love that's
Mangrove.
carbon?
Mangrove
Forest. But now I have a friend who's doing a regenerative shrimp mangrove forest combination that should be the future of farming. So it gets really important. It gets important for all of us to challenge ourselves and be like, look, there's some things like regenerative grazing is almost every case is going to be regenerative. And kelp forest production is inherently bringing other species because it's the bottom of the system, right? It's bringing all these other things inherently. It has a lot of inherent regenerative value. But doing certain types of fish in confined fish parts is not an inherent regenerative aquaculture. Sorry, I'm just going to point it out. So
that's true. Here's another great question, and I'll get you, John. Someone said, how laborious is the cultivation and the harvesting of seaweed? Is it more laborious than, say, agriculture?
Well, very good question. It is agriculture. And right now, up in Alaska, in a project that is being supported by the U.S. Department of Energy, we're working on scalable kelp farming. And that scalable kelp farming is farming the kelp at levels that will produce hundreds of thousands of pounds this year. And we're developing new generations of harvesting mechanisms. You talk about combines in agriculture. Well, we're developing something very similar to that in aquaculture for growing different types of kelp. Once again, we're using the principles of agriculture in the sea. And we're even
Does it take a lot of people though? Is it a big labor force or relative to agriculture?
Well, you know something? It's a lower labor force, and that is very important. In order for the United States to be competitive, we have to be technologically savvy. And so we have to always keep in mind labor costs. And if you're growing, say, major kelp up in Alaska, you also have to make sure your price point makes it competitive because your market's not in Alaska, it's in the lower 48 or across the pond in the Pacific over in Asia, because they want to have high quality food coming from the pristine waters of Alaska. And so this is really important, but I'd like to I think I could show a slide if you can give me a moment, and it is, would be very, very helpful. I think when we take a look at regenerative ocean farming, this is a beautiful cartoon by one of our project partners, a person who was our guinea pig ocean farmer, Brent Smith, became so successful, he created an organization called Green Wave, which is also in California. They were able to get the first seaweed permit up in Humboldt County, and they're doing regenerative farming. Notice they're growing seaweed, growing different types of shellfish there, and you can see there the size. You can scale this small for family farms, you can scale it larger, but it's regenerative. Here we are, carbon and nitrogen sink, zero inputs. We're not dealing with fresh water. We're not adding fertilizer. We're not adding pesticides. We're also producing structures that can act as storm surge protection. We're rebuilding marine ecosystems. And this is regenerative aquaculture of the 21st century. And we're linking that 21st century aquaculture back to the land in product development. And one of the biggest markets today in product development, where you can actually use large quantities of biomass of different types of kelp is the biostimulant market.
Mhm.
That is a market that we can then, in the United States, become global leaders there, going back and helping our agriculture with what we're growing in the sea. Now,
So how come there's so much aquaculture elsewhere in other countries and so forth, and relatively little here in the United States
What-
or off the coast of California? How come we're kind of behind in that? Does anyone know?
when we look at aquaculture,
I think
there
Charles
was in
is
this
frozen.
frozen.
Oh, there you are. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, when we look at aquaculture today, it's a necessity. And the opportunities for the US now really are substantial because of the demands. And I just want to point out that if you have a chance, there was a great story on 60 Minutes profiling our research on aquaculture the first time, a positive spin, because we're working with regenerative systems. And, you know, when Finian mentioned the fish pens, fed aquaculture, just like fed aquaculture of shrimp or fed aquaculture of fish, now the way to actually do your aquaculture of finfish is in a regenerative way where you use your shellfish and use your seaweed that are extracting nutrients out of the water, and you're capturing that. It mitigates the problems of nutrification in the marine environment there. And this is the way aquaculture is being progressing. And this is the aquaculture progressing even of finfish. People get it. You don't want to destroy your environment. And all along the way, now you have other products that you can work with. And this is something when we look at the integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, there are lots of other organisms you can grow with. You can get out of your system besides your dominant plants. The Asian market loves some of the animals down on the bottom that are eating the waste products. Sea cucumbers, very valuable. And so when we look at this, this is regenerative farming today, linking what's going on in the sea and opportunities back to the land.
That's amazing. Here's a good question, and I never thought about it. Can freshwater lakes be the site of aquaculture, or is it only in the oceans and saltwater?
Seaweeds themselves grow
They're
in
only saltwater.
oceans. Freshwater, in freshwater systems there, you can work with freshwater plants. There are freshwater plants and hydroponics there. You can work with that. You can grow freshwater plants and grow carp. Matter of fact, that was one of the first integrated multi-trophic aquaculture systems that were grown in Asia. And the Chinese had done that almost over 2,000 years ago. They were growing fish and freshwater plants. And carp production today is still the leading fish in Asia. And it's a freshwater animal growing with freshwater plants today.
Janet, it just seems like there's so many reasons why this business should just explode. What are the challenges in getting more, in particular, seaweed and kelp farms, off our coast? Getting them started and going.
One challenge is that there's a lot of caution being taken to make sure it's done right. Right. So just this kind of conversation that we're having about what is good for the ecosystem or not good for the ecosystem is being considered at many levels of government to make sure that we are doing things that are good for the system and that don't have negative impacts on the communities. So
what's an example of
challenge. There's also the market.
How might we do it wrong? Like, what would be a mistake, a poor way of doing it versus a smarter way of doing it?
Well, there's a lot of worry about some ways that fish farming was done a long time ago, and that isn't done very much anymore, where the fish were overfed, and in shallow water, and there was anoxia underneath and disease possibly to other fish, and that has kind of given aquaculture a bad rap. That is something left over from the past, really, that we're not really doing that kind of aquaculture anymore because we learned from that lesson. So, people are very cautious about it.
Okay, but you think it could be done well and done quickly, that we know enough now to do it right to start doing it on a larger scale?
Yes, and that we can start, in some places they're starting with just seaweed and shellfish permits, and leaving out, the fin fish that have to be fed something from somewhere else, like, from the land or from wild harvested fish. There are, interestingly, people who are growing microalgae to make fish feed for fish farms, which is a way to cut out that fishing problem.
Oh, interesting.
But yeah, that's a start, and we should absolutely start solving the problem, and add on the complications that make it harder as we go along, right? But we could start with the easier things.
Finin, go ahead. You want to say something?
Yeah, a couple things. I think, unfortunately, we're run with an economic world that is dictated by money often, which is frustrating, but also we got to use that where we can. And why I'm saying that is, when something is inherently regenerative, the input cost always go down. And what both doctors were talking about here is that when you do aquaculture, right, it's a no input system, and it's actually helping where other things are out of balance. But in agriculture, for example, I don't know, and this is a question to both of you. We're dealing with most agriculture, in the 90s percentage, most agriculture is degenerative. It's technically degrading the ecosystem with which it's being where it's occurring. And my question to you, and maybe I'm way off here, but my understanding of industrial aquaculture is that most of it was degenerative, meaning in the totality of what Dr. Charles was saying was like, is it rebuilding the marine ecosystem as a determinant of whether it was regenerative or not? From what I know, maybe I'm totally off. I thought most aquaculture, industrial aquaculture, was degenerative, and acre per acre in the ocean that we were degenerating with aquaculture. No?
Well, I'd like to correct you. In current
I'd love to be wrong. Sorry.
In current practices today, we've learned a lot from the ills of the Wild West mentality of aquaculture, where you really degraded the environment. I mean, when they were starting salmon aquaculture up in the state of Maine, they had something called green tides. Too much nutrients coming out of the salmon pens. Nobody was paying for regulation. I had a friend trying to start a little seaweed farm. They gave him a permit in an area where there wasn't enough nutrients, which is seaweeds like nutrients. So put seaweeds with where the fish were. So I got 30 nets, put them by the fish, and all of a sudden we grew seaweeds. And we told the coastal regulators, you got to do better job in your planning. And they get it now, because it costs a lot of money when you have fish that are not happy, that fish are dying, and the environmental damage is not easy to fix. So the most successful operations in fish aquaculture are the ones that are the cleanest. But then you ask yourself, once you put something in the sea, it becomes a little less controllable. Maybe it's better to grow your fish on land in recirculating systems where you can regulate all your inputs, leave the sea for the shellfish and the seaweeds, which are extractive organisms that can actually help the terrestrial system. And that's what's going on. And when we look at that today, that is really the action item of departments of agriculture around the globe. People understand it. We understand the issues much better than we did 20 or 30 years ago. And there
And
are
I have a couple questions. I'm going to extend our talk if we can for just 3 minutes because these are good questions. Real quick, are microplastics affecting aquaculture? This is such a big topic on people's minds. Is aquaculture affected by all the microplastics?
So microplastics show up in the guts of everything that lives in the ocean. They're in the sediments. Anywhere anyone has taken a sample and looked for them, this cat is out of the bag, right? So they're, whether your shellfish are mussels growing wild or mussels growing on a farm, they're going to be filtering some bits of plastic out.
Seaweed would not be affected by it?
So seaweeds have not been documented to be directly negatively affected by microplastics, though some microplastics stick to the surface of the seaweeds. And this is an active area of research now to see, whether the seaweeds end up with higher or lower concentrations of microplastics than are in the water. But yeah, microplastics are everywhere and we don't know their whole effect yet.
And one fun question, anyone making seaweed beer yet?
What was that?
Anyone making
Beer.
seaweed beer with
Yes.
recycled?
There are many breweries on the East Coast now.
Really?
Yes, and they all have beers. And I can tell you from a friend's brewery, the stout that he produced was as good as my favorite stouts from Ireland.
Oh.
And they make some good beers. So they are being developed in a lot of the microbreweries now in the East Coast.
Great. We're going to do final thoughts from Finian and then Janet. Go ahead, Finian.
I'm going to have to hop right after I'm
No worries.
I'm going to another event. Thank you so much. This has been incredible. I'm wish we could stay on for several hours here. My closing thought for this is, when we're in this world of how is agriculture being beneficial, again, for all of you who are out there encouraging yourself to be advocates for this, everything that the two doctors mentioned about what can happen with remediation is crucial for all of us to get, that we can actually have an impact where we're cleaning water, making it more bio, making it so our children can swim in bodies of water with their mouths open again. That's huge. But what I want to talk about is we have blood, or whatever you want to call it, gushing off the land. It's catastrophic. We have too much nitrogen fertilizer, too many tilled fields, 4 tons of topsoil per acre per year, carrying that sediment and all of those toxic chemicals into our waterways. So just a reminder to all the ocean lovers out there, our soil is broken. It's literally obliterated, falling apart, carrying with it mass amounts of toxic substances. And it's continuing on that trend of more inputs every year, more inputs every year. Yes, we can do amazing remediation work in the oceans and have a positive outcome there, but we also have to, for the very sake of the soil itself and for the sake of the ocean, on all these other unintended consequences that will keep mounting and will be harder for us to keep up with new solutions, we can solve it by regenerating the land. So when we talk about how much phosphorus and nitrogen is entering our waterways, when you do no-till, cover crops, and these methods of regenerative agriculture, your loss of soil can be nothing. You can be gaining soil, have zero runoff from your farm. So Florida, the person who talked about that, how much runoff are they dealing with? An insane amount.
Insane.
You can have no runoff. When you're doing regenerative properly, you're minimizing all runoff. Even if you're still using some chemicals, they're not running off. Sometimes they're leaching through, and that can still be a problem. But at the very least, they're not gushing off your land into our waterways for every rainstorm we have. So I'm imploring everyone out there who is an advocate for our oceans, please understand that so much of the impact that happens to our oceans that we're constantly having to deal with is stemming from our broken land that can be regenerated. And it can be just as profitable for the farmers doing it, and it can help all of these biodiversity things and sequester carbon from our atmosphere. So my last point, aquaculture is 3-dimensional regenerative agriculture. We have a very small dimension when we're doing agriculture, especially if it's not forest systems.
Yep.
In the sea, you have an amazing depth that's 3-dimensional. So I just want people to leave with that. 3-dimensional regenerative agriculture is what aquaculture can be. This has been really great. Thank you all so much for having me. I
Thank you,
appreciate
Finian. We know we have to go, so we'll let you go, and we'll give Janet her final,
Thank you.
for some final thoughts. Thank you, Finian.
Okay, I'm so excited about this whole discussion that we're having over the whole month of May here in this webinar series, starting off with this, what really do we mean by regenerative? And it has to include, what people are doing and what's happening in the ecosystem. And we have to have people who from different sectors, different backgrounds come together, and it's really important to bring in what we know about how ecosystems function normally to have a system that we build, right? That we can take that information from basic research and bring it into our technology and make technology that functions in the ecosystem and also gives us what we want to get out of it. So make sure you come back for all of the subsequent webinars this month.
Yeah,
And,
each Thursday.
each
Thursday at the
Thursday.
same time. We're going to explore different aspects of aquaculture. As you can see, it is multidimensional, and there's a lot of things to explore, including the economic benefits, job opportunities, et cetera, and more of the science. Janet, thank you so much. Charles, thank you much. Finian is gone, but I'll thank him especially, and to our sponsors, Cal State University Northridge, AltaSea, Beneficial State Bank, and the Los Angeles Coalition for the Economy and Jobs. And remember, this is recorded and available to be shared and watched again on the AltaSea website. So thank you all so much for your terrific participation and your great questions. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.